The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello, good evening, Billy Ray and Canisia. Such a privilege and honor to be in conversation with you today. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. These two books, The Idea of a Whole Life and The World After Rain, have filled my imagination for the last month. I can't think of a greater honor than to speak about these two books, to ask questions, hopefully not stupid questions. I'd like to begin with a very broad question. And I'm aware, judging from the applause, that many people here are familiar with your works, not only your poetry, but also your prose. You've earned passionate readers, not only here, but throughout the world. How would you situate these most recent books in terms of your body of work? What is different about these books, these projects, and what may mark a continuation of a project?
Okay, great question, thank you. So, and I've had actually a similar conversation about this with Canisia, who edited my book, that I thought of this one as the close of a triptych, that the three poetry collections I've written so far are an extension of a similar, my sort of attending to a set of similar questions about Indigenous life under colonialism, queerness, my cookum, and the boreal forest. With this book in particular, I was thinking about how to write an elegy for the boreal forest, where I'm from, in northern Alberta, Treaty Territory. With climate change, the boreal forest, scientists are detecting and predicting that the boreal forest will recede. And where I'm from, we're right where the boreal forest gives way to prairie. So if the boreal forest moves, that'll be catastrophic for the Cree people of northern Alberta. So I suppose with this book, I'm thinking about life, both my life, my family's, the lives of my family, but also the life of the boreal forest. And I suppose I want to carve open space for consideration of what the trees think and feel. And how I do that is by marshaling a sort of Cree philosophical and poetic tradition in which my flourishing, human flourishing, is bound up in the natural world. And I think it's the beginning, this book marks the beginning, I think, of a new trajectory for me, in which I want to continue to write about the forest, my community. I'm from essentially two places. Jerfpile is the reserve I'm from, and there's a small hamlet that neighbors it called Drusard that I grew up in. And these two small places, I think, tell a story about the country, its colonial history, and they sit right beside each other. They're entirely different places. One's marked as Indigenous, one is not, but of course they're both on ancestral Cree territory. So yeah, I'm trying to tell the story of that juxtaposition and the paradoxes that emerge in those two places being beside each other. Yeah.
Could I, forgive me for looking through my notes. I have 10 full pages of single-space notes, quotations, questions, ruminations. Again, 80% is questionable. But I was looking for a line I know I did write down, but it is lost somewhere here. It is a line, and I'm wondering if you recall it. It's such a powerful line, and it puts literature in relationship to to trees. Yeah, I wonder if you could just read that line.
I think it's from a poem called Endnotes. What I want from literature anyway.
That's it.
A new way of living, a new way to talk about the trees that doesn't endanger them.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Canisia, how would you situate this book in terms of your body of writings?
Thank you for the question. I think it's quite apart, in a sense, from my usual commitments to looking outward as a way to be grounded in an immediacy that is about our broader sense of relation. I find that a lot more generous for me as a person who thinks with language and a person who makes art. This book it came out of a singular experience. I don't think a book like this will ever happen again for me, because those exact circumstances only happen once in a person's life. And so, in a sense, I am still doing a similar work with my imagination, in that things become prismatic. I attend to the historical, to the ecologic, to the social and the cultural, but in this instance, it is the deeply interior alchemizing of coming to face the mortality of somebody you love. And in spite of the finitude that you see, usually for me, my work in all of my previous books, there's a kind of expansiveness to what I can see. I can see far. But for this one, it was simply that I needed to synthesize something that I didn't really know what it was. But I knew there was a great sense of loss. I knew there was a great sense of anticipation, of the kind of grief that exceeds its bounds. And so if you're faced with the mortality of your mother, and you have to accompany them to that end, it produces something completely apart from anything else you experience in life, even with all of the complications of what living a life might mean. So in a sense, the book came out of a sense of inarticulation. There was something I could not articulate in the experience of coming to face to face with that sense of loss that was coming at you fast. But that turned out to be very slow. And I didn't really intend to publish the book. It was a poem I needed to write because I knew poetry was a place that I could go with anything and it would receive. So this is something completely apart from every other book project that I've worked on.
I find it extraordinary to hear that the book was initially imagined as something not necessarily to be published. Perhaps, if I could invoke this term, personal. I wanted to, the plan, there was always a plan, and then we deviate from the plan. So the plan was that I would ask Billy Ray and Canisia to read a short passage from their books right now. But that exchange, I wonder if I could ask one more question. And I guess it does pertain to the personal in your books. I see this as a tricky question, a fundamentally tricky question. And in invoking the personal, first of all, I want to draw your attention to two thinkers that I know you each know. First, Christina Sharp, who, following Sadea Hartman, asserts in her book, In the Wake, that the personal is not about navel-gazing, or it can be not about navel-gazing. It is not the simplistic expression of an uncomplicated self. It is a window onto life that is intended, and these are the words by Hartman, reproduced by Sharp, intended to counter the abstractions of history. And similarly, another thinker I want to invoke in this context is Deanna Reeder, who in her book, Autobiography as Indigenous Intellectual Tradition, offers me, for the first time, not for others, a Cree term for autobiography, and that is Achimi Sowina, could be translated as little stories. Little stories that project cultural resurgence and deep philosophical interrogation. I guess the reason I'm just invoking these thinkers is that I want to I want to ask you about the personal in ways that bypass the ways we often talk about the personal. And I simply want to ask, how did you, in the writing practice, explore the personal? How did you access it? How did you manifest it on the page? And a separate question, and this is the question that might come back and bite me, which is, but I feel prompted to ask it, is how do you feel about the question of the personal now that you've finished a book and you're sitting in front of an audience and people are asking you to use the personal as a means to get into the book? Is that helpful or is that distractive? That's a lot to throw all of a sudden at once, but yeah, the personal.
You're both looking at me. So this makes me think of something I wrote in my novel, A Minor Chorus, where the narrator reflects on whether it's possible to write a novel in the voice of a community rather than just in his voice. And he says something like he's trying to figure out what the texture of the first person plural is. It might be a little self-aggrandizing to say that that's what I'm trying to do in my poetry as well, because I think I will inevitably fail to do it. But I think both in my citational practice and in my effort to marshal some aspect of the voice of my community and of my family in my work across genres, I think pertains to what you're asking, which is that for me the personal is always already a site of the collective or the communal. In part because, I mean, I think it was Judith Butler who has this really beautiful phrase where they say something like, you know, the I coheres in relationship to you. Like, I do not exist without you. And I think my writing is a sort of a mode of attention to that experience of being enmeshed with, you know, a you. And again, to circle back to my first point, I don't know if I'm always able to do that. But that's part of the existential condition that we write under, is that we fail to grasp, you know, or to fully, you know, acquire what we want.
I wrote a whole book about this subject. Clearly, you have not left it behind. Uh, but I long harbored skepticism about the lyric position of that first person singular. My initial education or miseducation in it suggested that it was a very narrow space. But I think that's what you do when you attempt to learn, when you attempt to grasp at something. You perceive what is limited because you're not yet capacious enough to traverse what's there. But in the case of the personal, the lyric subject that I was skeptical of was about the orthodoxies of selfhood that are reduced purely to the utilitarian, purely to what is transactional, which is our kind of neo-colonial condition. And anytime I tried to deploy it in a poem, it was the loudest register. And so I had to figure out why that was, and in a sense, undo my distrust of it so that I can apprehend what was more capacious in it. So the quality of introspection in the personal, for me, has grown since I had to do it in order to be able to actually do this work. And so I never go alone to the page. And I think that was probably almost always already the truth. And I engage in a quite enthusiastic practice when I write. The practice of thinking with others, the practice of being in conversation and being intertextual. For me, I think that gives me a much richer sense of what it is to be alive. And my sense of the artistic is deepened in that mode. And so to be able to say or to be able to speak from the personal with confidence, I also have to be somehow grounded in a relational context with what others have said, what others have done, and in a sense, the networks of thinking that produce great art, I think, are strengthened in that way when we can enter a room and say, there's already a conversation ongoing, and I know where I stand.
Was there something in, just a quick follow-up question, was there something in the subject matter of this, or that you were addressing in this book, that made the eye available and productive in a way that it wasn't before?
There was less of that kind of thought going on here. This poem is what came out of me sitting at my table for some countable hours, about 16 hours or so, after a really unfortunate experience that my mother had at the hospital. And it affected me in such a way that I had to do something with that experience. And for me, language was the way that I had to, in a sense, not interrogate anything, not proceed in any kind of analytical fashion, but simply to arrive at a kind of inevitability. And so I was not in the way of this poem, in a sense, at all. It arrived. And by, in so doing, in that arrival, I came to, I think I realized something of the kind of subterranean quality of poetry and the way that it can move in the body through the flesh. And it's really just that, So it was less a project of thinking than it was a feeling. And yeah, and then emerging from that feeling, having produced this work, that it was so tender. That I just put it away, put it in a drawer for a long time, because it was about 10 years ago.
Thank you for that. Billy Ray, would you be willing to read from your book? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for being here, by the way. On a kind of cold evening at the end of November, somehow.
I think that's where we are.
We arrived here. Okay, I'm gonna read, I think, 2 poems. Okay. They have the same title, 20th Century Cree History. Nothing is truly inexpressible. Picture the women waiting at the forest center, their hands folded into little coffins. Not even the snow falls with such imprecise hunger. In time, love deranges all of us. In time, all love is reduced to the childlessness of music. A painting of a palace with 600 rooms, in each a mechanical bowl, thronging violently. Most days, my job is to work out the difference between truth and honesty. True or false, we are a closer catastrophe than heaven. An invisible war, but the soldiers are everywhere. No bombs because they planted them inside us already. In the middle of the night, the sun materialized on the bedroom walls, beams of light shooting out from God's fists. Dear God, why does the rain fill me up so fast? And when will we come up with another word for salvation? I met the minister of loneliness, and even he was drowning. Don't worry, my love. All our parents are immigrants from a wounded century. Please keep me company in these rare hours during which we truly see each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy Ray. I wanted to, there is a quotation from a different poem that I wonder if I could bring into conversation with you, with what you've just read. Title of the poem that was 20th Century Cree History. And elsewhere you write, we are not citizens of a country, we are citizens of a century. I wonder if you could comment a bit on that line.
Yeah, I'll just make reference to the poem. So the organizing thesis of the book is that the 20th century never ended. And that, I think, statement is obvious to most Cree people, that the 21st century did not inaugurate a new political era for Cree people, but in fact was an extension of the previous one. And it seems more likely to me that if we are citizens, it is not of Canada. It is of that century, which transformed us in many inalterable ways. But that poem begins with a longish quote, or a longish kind of paratext epigraph combination, in which I note that the drift pile band, the reserve boundary for it was first mapped out in 1900, and that it officially, a survey was officially conducted in 1901. And so I write, my hypothesis, all the people of drift pile were born in 1901. 1901 never ended. Tomorrow it'll be 1901 again.
Thank you. Thank you, Billy Ray. Canisia, would you read from your book?
I am keeping time, Mama, the time of stop signs and swarms, or learning to be nevertheless transparent as a wall. Here, we've left salt at every limit, cells dividing the loyalties of each word we hold, abrupt in the presence of copied time, of poisoned mandible, the open bar of embarrassing questions. There's no ambition more skeletal than this heart leaping like a toad in our chest. Besides, I detect bargains, Mother, and you must come again to this howling. Will an ounce of honey do, neighbor? A piece of bread for hungry death, my dear? Say the minty stillness of a Monday afternoon on second thought. What if life verves toward the heart and stops? My too hard skull endures for the hotness of this thinking. The misread telecasts already voiced in cause. Here, not spoiled, we know what the living do. I am taken with you, named after a saint, freely into this provenance of fruit bats. Following quick time, the softening tracks, cool and excellent. Huts already tremble where you walk. And in another poem, another poet's grandfather recites a different ode. I catch in its lampooned phrases the black liquids of a country of quietness draining from your throat. I don't tell you how this unsolvable room cleaves us, binds us again, how we were left to your bile ducts drizzling or torrents unnamed, our non-weeping right eye, untrained for the marks of our forefeet, along what I dread and need. You cannot have the memories I hold. Your childhood in ancillary, soon updated into our wet forms. Enough. We will be chorused around disorder. Woman who exceeds how we are astonished into the last few hours of August by the whipping work of conclusion. Torso defined by a strong curve, hotly odored by the interior of a lesion, a taut membrane around our lives. The flammable blue light of our smoked mountain fading, potassium carbonate sawing the infected woods. The traps entering this story's wordless idea of a world without hail, without ill. These are not my traps to tell. Time, worshiping time, is a mother image, protracted bone from barking spine. I reject, Anne, the ceremony of this metal mouth closing over your life. Oh, stop. Oh, stop. Oh, stop. Say stop. Say the passing of you from breath I have felt to memory I have fashioned. Is this how to forget? I am forgetting the twinliness of life and death, our movements between forms.
Thank you, Canisia. In the passage you read, and elsewhere in the book, particularly near the end, the word astonished does a variety of work. And there is a passage, for instance, later in the book, page 95, and from fine print time, very interesting phrase itself, fine print time. And from fine print time, disclose the world. The grasses sing how we are astonished, singing, we'll sing forever in your wake. I wanted to ask you about that word. You, as with Billy Ray, you are so scrupulously attentive to the language that you're using in this book. It is hard not to notice again the repetition of that word, astonished. Hard not to think about the word, its etymology, its use. What work does it do for you?
So that word was the closest description or adjective to what I experienced in that summer, that one summer a decade ago.
You mean experiencing, are you talking about experiencing anticipatory grief? Is that it?
Well, that arrived after.
Okay.
No, but it was the actual unfortunate medical scenario
Okay.
that led to this, to the anticipatory part of grief. But the astonishment of it, it was so intensely shocking to my system that, that it became the operative word for the poem, for the experience, for everything I was rejecting in it. Everything was bound up in this sense of astonishment, in how large it all was, in how insignificant it makes a person feel. And of course, I didn't conceive of it immediately as anticipated grief. I kind of arrived there, because I wrote to a point, and I thought, there's a line that I repeat in the poem in a kind of palindromic fashion where I write toward a line and then I reverse course. It is silly to mourn you, still alive, still alive. It is easy, or is it silly to mourn you? It was that realization that, anticipated grief does a kind of work, and it doesn't really get talked about very much. And, I thought I could not possibly be the only person experiencing this kind of thing. But it is a conversation I had actually never had with anyone, and I could not remember having. Or being, even eavesdropping. It's just not a thing that was part of my consciousness, my waking life. And so the work that astonishment does is manifold. It's both, a kind of awe of the vastness of a kind of celebration of something, and on the other end, a really acute sense of grief, a very acute sense of loss, that being twinned led me to the poem. And that is what I kind of wanted to sit with and stay with, and perhaps, dislodge the sense of anger that I was feeling.
I don't know if this line from your poem reveals too much, or how you would connect it to that very sentiment, but there is the line, the great anchor of one doctor's crime against three others' love. I find that such a, where it is situated, it's such an ache of a line.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Billy Ray, there are so many formal, stylistic aspects of your book that I'm truly enthralled by, and I find so moving, truly moving. One thing I'm going to ask you about, the thing I'm not going to ask you about, which is the presence of an adjusted sonnets in your book, which I find so interesting. And there's a companion line, maybe a sonnet can be a gay space that is weirdly liberating. What I want to ask you is about, in fact, about, and this is how I would describe it. And I see this in other texts by you, and I'm quite fascinated by this formal. I would say the power of the aphorism in your work, and I could have a long list of the aphorisms in your book. Some of them, just repeating some of them. There is a blank space inside all natives that history lays claim to. Or, history is an impossible demand. Most likely it's what happens when no one is looking. Or, I've got the, what do I want from literature anyway? I'm going to repeat it. It was such a beautiful line. What do I want from literature anyway? A new way of living, a new way to talk about the trees that doesn't endanger them. Or, history is a type of affective access. It leaks like a long novel. Anyway, there are just so many. Are you conscious about using the aphorism, of landing on it at particular places in a poem? I guess that is my question. There are other writers who swear by blood and write by blood and aphorisms. That's how one writes. I don't write that way, but others write that way. I find it such a striking device. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the aphorism has always seemed to me to be a poetic gesture, in part because I did not have a formal creative writing education. I absorbed, poetic knowledge through what I was reading and through, seeking it out on the internet, reading, poems on Tumblr, and watching videos of spoken word poetry on YouTube. But perhaps more importantly, I arrived at theory first, and queer theory specifically. And if you've read any queer theory, you'll know that the aphorism is a sort of important instrument of queer theorizing. I think, for example, of Lauren Berlant's work, and a sort of somewhat psychoanalytical strain of queer theory that also is interesting to me, by way of Lee Edelman and others in the sort of queer negativity cluster that I do not see myself a part of, but I am paying attention to what they're thinking about. But I fell in love with queer theory in part. I've said this at another event here in Toronto, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But I fell in love with queer theory in part because of the beautiful sentences. And so I was sort of clued into this mode of writing quite early on in my adulthood, which is that a beautiful sentence could compel someone to live. And it cannot alone sustain life. I'm aware of that. But it can, I think, help enable life, especially under the, threat of the many-headed beast of colonial capitalism, et cetera.
Thank you. I saw a 10-minute sign a little while ago. How much more time do I have? 2? Okay, so I have one more question for you two. I guess it's the most, it falls at the end of my script. It's It's the, in certain ways, it's the most compelling question for me, and it's the least well developed. So I hope you'll bear with me. I guess my question is about how these two books, about, conversely, private grief, personal grief, not only that, but that a part of that, about discrete moments in a life, nevertheless, how both of these books scale up to something much larger, necessarily, in their content and their engagement. I can't help but ask this question, thinking about the titles of your books, the idea of an entire life, the world after rain. For me, the question I want to ask is connected to a line that Dion Brand offers. I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's close to this. The imperative to write is if the world you know is the world, period, or is it the world entirely? And again, it is something about how the personal, how the discrete, how the seemingly small scales to the very highest. Does that make sense at all? Is that a question that could be answered?
I think so, yeah.
I think I'm going to rely on their generosity.
Do you want to tackle that first?
Suppose. Well, the elegy is a relational form.
Right.
It is about how one private grief relates to another, to another, to another. And inside of that sense of relation, there is enough tissue and density to look at something as corrosive as loss, as disfiguring as grief. At least in a way that allows for something to be reclaimed, something to be held in memory. Part of the memorializing work of the elegy is that something persists, that in spite of finitude and mortality and, the detritus of living, there is something that exceeds what will no longer be there or is no longer there, right? So there is the present tenseness to poetry itself, that the working of the tense that is moving from past to present and perhaps even a kind of future perfect tense, is that what we claim as our own does not necessarily have a terminus that says no one else's voice can find it. I think it's precisely because other people's voices find what's there that the elegy does its best work, and so that is really like the function of the elegy. For me, will always be deeply relational, right? And so it's the way that I'm looking at my grief and looking at the grief of others in a time so thick with grief. This is, I think, the condition of the world that we have presently. Its primary condition is one of grief. It's just so much of it in the world right now. And so there is not a way for us to not be affected, even as we voice, our particular experience of it, it's a global kind of experience.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I want to say two things. Firstly, that it's been such a delight to get to share space and stages with you. This is our third event now.
Yeah, we're on a, what do you call it?
It's a tour.
And if you're lucky enough, you'll get to publish your book at the same time as someone that you adore, and so thank you for that. And secondly, that at my very first poetry reading, or at the very first event I read poetry at, which was in Edmonton, there was someone in the audience who came up to me after to tell me that she had had a son who was a queer Indigenous person who had passed away, and she had not been able to raise him, and so never really got to know him. And she said to me that in hearing my poems, it gave her a sense of who he might have been. And so literally from that very first moment that I was on a stage reading my poetry, I was like oriented in the collective project of poetry, which I think is in part the work of creating space for shared grief, which I think is what you're articulating too, and also the work of our shared subjectivity, which we're always working on, and so I've never lost sight of that, and I think that I've also been directed in unconscious ways or unspoken ways, by my community, for example, by the land, our ancestral territory, to contend with larger social, political, economic problems, and that ultimately what my, I think, aesthetic undertaking is I think something shared, I think, by a number of writers who are writing in sort of anti-colonial, sort of utopian, radical tradition, which is inviting others to share in the desire for another world, and to remind us that it is within our capacity to both imagine it and to bring it into being.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's again speaking to